Welcome. We're now in the home stretch of the semester. And for the remainder of the semester, I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture of language typology and what that has to do with the kind of uh, grammar and grammatical formalisms that we've been trying to develop in this class. Um, and yeah, so let me start out by talking a little bit about universals. And this is not just universals in the sort of Chomskyan sense, but this is universals in the traditional study of typology, and how they do and don't relate to things that we do in the generative tradition of linguistics. So let's start out with the sort of most basic thing here, which is a substantive universal. This is a universal about something that every language has or that no language has, right? So this is the sort of most basic thing you could think of when you're thinking about linguistic universals. It'll be like every language has this thing, or there's no language that has this thing. That said, these are not the only kinds of universals that you can imagine. And in particular, we've seen a number of cases this semester where I've at least suggested to you some implicational universals. And these are a little bit more complicated. This is not saying that every language has an X or no language has a Y. What this is saying is this kind of universal is that, well, if you find a language with X, then it also has Y, but not vice versa. So not every language with Y also has X, but every language with X also has Y. That's a so-called implicational universal. And then there's a third sense here, which is not going to be terribly relevant to this class, but it's super important for linguistics in general. And this is the kind of universal that many Chomskyan and generative linguists tend to be interested in. And this is not about sort of things that you can observe on the surface, like every language has an adjective, which is not true. But this is a formal universal. And it says that every language or no language will allow structure X, right? Where what structure means here is going to be something that's abstracted away from the linguistic surface. So an example from syntactic theory would be the proposal that every language has hierarchically headed phrases or something like that. That's not something you can look at a sentence in English or Spanish or Russian and just figure out. This is something that relies on analysis of the kinds of surface features you find. These are often taken to be the most important universals for generative linguists, that is, linguists who study grammar as a system of mental or cognitive capacity. Right? What is the human capability to learn and speak languages? Those types of linguists often take formal universals to be the most important. But this is, my rough three-way division between different kinds of universals that might be out there. And I want to talk a little bit about at least the first two here with regard to phonological theory. And actually, we'll draw in the third as well, although in a sort of indirect way. So let's start with substantive universals. And I'm going to start by telling you that substantive universals are kind of useless. So the search for substantive universals has been largely fruitless. There's not that many of them, as far as we can tell. And even when we do find substantive universals, it's not really clear that they teach us anything. So here's an example. This is from a typology database. It's the UCLA Phonological Segment Inventory database, and it's an online resource that you can consult to look at the rough phonemic inventory of a number of different languages around the world. I think there's maybe 500 or 600 languages in this database. And it sort of lists each of them as a database entry with the contrastive phonemic consonants in each language. And so here are all the languages in this UPSID database that have 10 or less contrastive consonants. Right? So you can see the winner here is Rotakas, which has only 6 contrastive consonants. And then if you look down here under the 8 consonant systems, there's a number of these. These are Austronesian languages, Amazonian languages, and there's some with 9 and a few with 10, and so on and so forth. So what do we learn from looking at these very small consonant inventories? Well, there are some substantive universals that probably hold if we just look at these extreme endpoints of the consonant inventory complexity continuum. So maybe every language has at least one stop or at least one obstruent or something like that. That seems to hold at least for these languages we're looking at here and all the other languages we've looked at this semester, maybe every language has at least one coronal sound. So you can see most of these languages have a coronal stop. Hawaiian doesn't seem to have one, but Hawaiian does have a coronal nasal and a lateral segment that's coronal. So maybe every language has at least one coronal sound, right? That's a substantive universal. Every language has at least one voiced and one voiceless sound. And I mean, the voice part here would actually be satisfied just by vowels, assuming that every language has vowels. And it looks like, all of these languages have at least one voiceless stop or something like that. So that's maybe a substantive universal. And then the question is going to be, well, so what? I mean, what do we do with that information? If we're trying to study language as a sort of human capacity for learning and cognition, what does it teach us that we find these kinds of substantive universals? Maybe humans have an innate predisposition to produce stops or to produce obstruents or to produce coronal sounds, or maybe humans are genetically predisposed to producing voicing or the lack of voicing or something like that. That would be, maybe it's like part of universal grammar that says, hey, you better have stops or something like that. But probably that's not what's going on here. And for sure, if you're trying to convince somebody that humans have some kind of an innate capacity for language, they're not really going to be convinced by facts like this because, maybe all of these substantive universals are the product of some sort of innate genetic predisposition for language, or maybe these are just really good solutions to particular problems in the environment, right? Maybe these are particularly easy ways to produce or perceive sound given the constraints of the human vocal tract. Right? So an analogy from biology here, where we're studying the actual evolution of species, and note that linguistic evolution is very different. So this is just an analogy, but in convergent evolution, where we have these complex biological systems, namely organisms that evolve over time, many species can end up with similar features. For instance, wings have evolved several times in the history of animals. They've evolved in the mammals, in the reptiles, in the insect world separately. Camera eyes, these have evolved several times in the course of biological history of the Earth. A streamlined body shape for swimming, right? A number of animals have that kind of a streamlined body shape, including fish and mammals that are not related to each other. And the point here is that you can end up with these features even though the species that are evolving them are not related in any way, and there's no historical contingency between, say, bats evolving wings and pterodactyls evolving wings. These are just because all of these problems are good biological solutions to particular problems in the environment, like how can I fly? There's not that many different ways to fly, right? What would be a good way to register physical stimuli in the environment through one of my sense organs? Well, camera eyes are an especially good way to register patterns of light and darkness that correspond to physical objects in your environment. What about streamlined body shape for swimming? Well, that's a good solution for how do I move around in the water, right? So we don't think there's, anything deep or biological or genetic about the ties between dolphins and, sharks. They both happen to have evolved a streamlined body shape because they both evolved in an environment that required them to move around in the water, or at least favored the ability to move around in the water. And similarly, you can imagine that humans might have always be producing stops and coronal sounds and so on and so forth, because those are good ways to produce noises with your mouth if you're going to be evolving a communication system, right? Try imagining speaking a language where you just don't use the front of your tongue at all. That's going to be really pretty unlikely to arise by chance in an environment where you're trying to communicate with other organisms. And over time, it would be very strange if a language retained a property of never using the front of the tongue when the whole sort of means behind creating the externalization of spoken languages involves manipulating parts of your vocal tract to make pressure waves. it would be strange if there were a language that just failed to utilize an entire portion of that vocal mechanism. Right? So really, it's not clear we're learning much of anything from looking at these sort of extreme endpoints of variation on the typological scale. And of course, the analogy with biological evolution here is just an analogy. The dynamics of language evolution, which is put in scare quotes here because it's not really evolution in the biological sense, the dynamics of how languages change and adapt over time are very different from how genes and organisms adapt and change over time in biology. I'll have a bit more to say about that later. Here's the other end of the complexity scale of human languages for consonant systems. And this is from a language, it's a Tu language spoken in Botswana, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of this language because it begins with what I think is an alveolar click sound, and it also has a partially nasalized vowel, possibly with breathy voice or something like that on it. So clicks are these sounds that are not made with your lungs at all, so they're non-pulmonic consonants. They instead use an airstream mechanism that's referred to as the velaric airstream mechanism. And this is a mechanism that uses the body of your tongue and your velum, which separates your oral cavity and your nasal cavity, to create an abrupt change in pressure inside your oral and nasal cavities, which in turn, as we know from studying stops in class, if you have a rapid change in pressure, it creates an acoustic transient, like a burst, a click, tap, or pop, or something like that. And that's what these sounds roughly sound like. That's why they're called click consonants. These are fairly rare in the world's languages. They exist only in southern and eastern Africa in a large collection of languages that originally was analyzed by linguists as being a single family, which was referred to as Khoisan. Although nowadays typologists think that in fact there are at least 3 distinct language families that used to be included under that classification. In any case, there's just this one group of languages in southern and eastern Africa that uses click consonants. They're unattested anywhere else in the world, and it's thought that these probably evolved fairly early in the history of human language, and that they survive only in the cradle of human biology, of where humans evolved, which is essentially Central and Southern Africa. So this is the idea. And so this particular language, I'm going to refer to this as Ko. I think that's a perfectly acceptable English pronunciation of the name of the language. And they have actually already a fairly complex consonant system when you don't even stop to consider the click consonants yet. They already have at least 5 different kinds of laryngeal states for their consonants. They have voiced, voiceless, voiceless aspirated, breathy voiced, and ejective consonants. Oh, and there's a voiceless series as well. So there are tons and tons of laryngeal, interesting, complex phonology involving laryngeal features in this language. And then in addition, they have nasals and glottalized consonants. So already, this is a very complex consonant system. But this does not even take into account, there is an entire other system of click consonants that come at 5 different places of articulation and combine with just about all of the laryngeal and manner features that we saw in this chart up here. Those also hold for click consonants, and they also come in these sort of complex affricate-like combinations of different kinds of click and non-click consonants. So this one is for instance, a voiced velar plosive followed by aspiration and some kind of a click in the middle. And these function apparently as single consonants in this language. And so if you count these all up, Ko has roughly 180 contrastive consonants. So that's a lot. I did pull up, just for fun here, this is the Course in Phonetics website that's linked from our website, and there are some early recordings of these some of these Ko clicks here. Make sure I'm getting, I got the view more or less okay. All right, so I'm going to play you these. These are not the most wonderful audio, they're old recordings, but here are 5 different clicks at different places of articulation. These are also followed by some very different vowels that involve various combinations of nasalization and breathy and creaky voice. But pay attention to the click parts of these. So that's sounds like a fricative followed by a click. Oh no, sorry, that was a bilabial click. Here's a dental click. Here's an alveolar click. Here's a palatal click. So I'm sorry, I'm playing some of these in succession just so you can hear the contrast. And here's a lateral click. So those are two phonemically different click consonants. Obviously, pretty hard for speakers of non-click languages to hear those distinctions, but I'm sure that they're super obvious to a co-speaker. And so this is a language with an extraordinary number of phonemically contrastive consonants. And these click consonants are not marginal in these languages. Something like 80% of all the lexical items in this language begin with a click consonant. That said, they do positionally neutralize with other non-click consonants. So word or stem initial is the most common position to find these clicks. Elsewhere in the word or the phrase, they tend not to be present. That said, I mean, there's still at least 180 phonemically distinct consonants in this language. Oh, one more misunderstanding that people sometimes have about so-called click languages. When we call something a click language, we mean that it's a language that has clicks in it. People sometimes think that this means the language consists only of clicking sounds. That is not any human language. There is no human language that works that way. All of these languages also have vowels, and all of them also have non-click consonants, just to be clear about that. So what does this tell us? The most complex consonant system on the planet Earth has 180 consonant sounds. So what? So humans have a hardwired genetic constraint that makes it impossible to learn languages with more than 180 consonant sounds? Well, no, probably not. That's almost certainly not what's going on here. What's probably happening is just that as you increase the number of phonemes, the probability of a language having that many phonemes decreases, right? So it's extremely unlikely for a language to have 180 phonemes. It's much more likely for a language to have, say, 80 or 60 or 30 phonemes. And it's even more unlikely for a human language to have 240 phonemes. In fact, it's so unlikely we've never observed one, right? But there's nothing sort of interesting or principled about that particular number, 180. So this language code could go through a sound change tomorrow that would give it 181st phoneme, right? And do you think that suddenly speakers would unlearn the language at that point, or that the next generation of babies would just completely fail to learn the language? It seems extremely unlikely, right? There's nothing special about the number 180. This happens to be the uppermost reach of consonant complexity that we've discovered in the sample of languages that linguists have been able to examine. But it's not really giving us anything special or unique about the human capacity for language. It's just sort of collecting exotica. And there is, I guess I should say that when I'm talking in this lecture about how we don't really care that much about substantive universals, there is some sort of intellectual, theoretical consideration behind that we think it's more interesting to look at the properties of individual grammars and see what those reveal about human cognition than it is to sort of look at all the messy surface facts of languages and try to reach conclusions about those. We just think that that first approach of thinking about this in terms of grammar and cognition is more likely to succeed. But there's also a little bit of a subsidiary consideration here, which is that when we go around collecting these super exotic systems, given that most languages in the world are spoken by small groups of people who tend to be economically underprivileged in parts of the world that are not basically Western Europe and North America, and that anything we think of as exotic is likely to be something that's not from Europe or North America. There's a real danger that as we're looking for all these kinds of crazy extreme patterns, that we're exoticizing these languages, right? These are crazy things that only happen in Southern Africa or something like that. And that's really a silly way of thinking about language. Because first of all, if we are talking about a system that's subject to some sort of genetic influence or biological influence within the human species, then for sure these kinds of languages that are spoken by relatively small groups in remote parts of the world, often that are not modern industrialized nations, that's going to be far more typical of the conditions under which humans evolved than modern day Europe and North America are, or something like that. So these would, in some sense, be the less exotic languages from the perspective of human history. And languages like English and Spanish and Russian are the exotic ones. They're spoken in these bizarre environments that have nothing to do with the conditions under which humans evolved. But more generally, just because most of the diversity of the world's languages is attested in places that are not Western industrialized rich countries, of course, most of the extreme endpoints that we find in linguistics are going to be languages with those properties. It's nothing about the cultures or the people who speak these. These are not exotic patterns. These are just part of the general tapestry of linguistic diversity in the world. So there's some sort of not very exciting generalizations about consonants. Maybe next we'll look at some, in the next video, some not super exciting generalizations about vowels.